The valley had gone quiet, too quiet. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb pressed his back against the shattered mud wall, feeling the warm trickle of blood from his shoulder mixing with the dust that coated everything. Around him, what remained of his 8-man reconnaissance team had shrunk to 3. The Taliban had them surrounded in a compound that offered exactly zero strategic advantage and even less hope. They'd called for extract 40 minutes ago, 40 minutes that felt like drowning in slow motion. The radio crackled with static and distant voices coordinating assets they didn't have, discussing timelines that didn't matter. Webb knew the math. He'd done it 100 times in training. Air support was 18 minutes out. Medevac was 25. The enemy advancing through the poppy fields would reach effective range in 4, maybe 5 if they were cautious. They wouldn't be cautious. Not anymore. Corporal Davis, the youngest of them at 22, kept glancing at the doorway like salvation might walk through it wearing body armor and carrying extra ammunition. His hands shook as he reloaded his rifle for the 3rd time with the same magazine muscle memory, attempting to solve a problem that had no mechanical solution. Private First Class Chen no relation to any Chen that mattered. He joked when people asked had stopped talking entirely. That scared Webb more than the blood or the bullets or the certainty settling into his chest like winter fog. Chen always talked. Even in Helmand when they'd spent 16 hours pinned down by sniper fire, Chen had narrated every thought, every fear, every stupid memory from basic training. Silence from Chen meant he'd already done his own math. Webb keyed his radio one more time, knowing the answer before he asked. Phantom 7, this is Reaper 2-1, requesting immediate close air support, how copy? The response came through layers of static and strategic reality. Phantom 7 had birds in the air. Phantom 7 had ordnances and pilots and all the technological superiority that American air power could marshal. What Phantom 7 didn't have was time or physics or a way to bend either. The nearest strike package was an F-16 already engaged 12 kilometers north. The Apache gunships were refueling. The AC-130 was weathered out of the operational area. Webb closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the wall. 18 minutes might as well be 18 hours. He could hear Davis's breathing getting faster, that pre-panic rhythm every combat veteran recognized. Could smell the copper and cordite mixture that meant they were all bleeding from somewhere. Outside, voices called to each other in Pashto, coordinating their final approach with the casual confidence of men who knew they had already won. Then someone else came on the radio, a voice Webb didn't recognize. Calm, almost bored, female. Reaper 2-1, Hog 3-7. I'm 8 mics out with 30 mic and a full load of Mavericks. Give me a count and compass heading on those fighters moving through your sector. Webb's eyes opened. 8 minutes wasn't 18. 8 minutes was possible, but the voice continued before he could process hope beyond its basic chemical formula. Be advised, Reaper, I'm trailing smoke and running on one engine, but I've still got teeth and you're not dying in that shithole today. Mark your position with orange smoke if you've got it. Otherwise give me grid coordinates and I'll make my own fireworks. Davis actually laughed. It came out broken and slightly unhinged, but it was laughter. Chen raised his head, eyes focusing for the first time in 10 minutes. Webb grabbed his radio with hands that had stopped shaking without him noticing. Hog 3-7, Reaper 2-1, you're coming in damaged. Damaged is relative, Reaper. I'm flying, I'm fighting, and I'm 400 meters from making these assholes regret their career choices. Your coordinates, Marine, now. Webb rattled off the numbers, his brain cataloging details even as his training took over. Thunderbolt, the Warthog, close air support platform designed around a 30mm rotary cannon that could shred tanks like aluminum foil. Single-engine operation meant she'd taken catastrophic damage. Trailing smoke meant fire or structural failure. And she was still coming, still flying toward contact instead of away from it. The Taliban fighters had reached the outer wall. Webb could hear them clearly now, talking about positions, about covering fire, about the timing required to storm a building full of Americans who'd stopped shooting back to conserve ammunition they didn't have. He popped orange smoke and threw it through a window gap, watching the chemical cloud billow into the crystalline Afghan afternoon. Smoke is out, Hog 37. Orange smoke marking friendly position. Enemy is mobile, approximately 40 personnel in scattered groups advancing from the north and northwest. Danger close is acceptable. We are combat ineffective and this is our last play. Copy danger close. Reaper, I'm going to ask you to keep your heads down for the next 90 seconds. It's about to get biblical out there. Webb pulled his team back from the windows and covered his ears. Davis and Chen followed without question, pressing themselves against the interior wall like they could merge with the mud and clay and disappear into the foundation. The sound reached them before the visual, because sound always traveled faster than understanding in combat. The A-10's GAU-8 Avenger cannon didn't sound like other weapons. It didn't crack or pop or bang. It roared. A deep, resonating brrrrrrt that seemed to come from the earth itself, from something primordial and unstoppable, from the mechanical embodiment of consequences finding their appointed targets. The building shook. Dust fell from the ceiling in sheets. Outside, the voices stopped. Not gradually, not with trailing screams or shouted warnings. They just stopped, replaced by the wet, final sounds of 30mm depleted uranium rounds, traveling at nearly 900 meters per second into human bodies. The A-10 passed overhead low enough that Webb could hear the shriek of damaged metal, could smell the burning fuel even through the compound's walls. He risked a glance through the window gap and saw its gray-green camouflage paint scheme, distinctive twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, though only the right engine showed thrust. The left trailed black smoke thick enough to write messages in the sky. The aircraft banked hard, wings nearly vertical, turning inside its own wingspan with the kind of maneuverability that physics shouldn't allow for something built around a cannon the size of a Volkswagen. Reaper 2-1, Hog 3-7. I've got Mavericks remaining, but I'm saving those for anything with armor. Doing another gun run on the northwest approach, you've got fighters trying to regroup in that dried creek bed. Should I light them up or are we being diplomatic today? Webb looked at Chen, who had started breathing normally. At Davis, whose hands had stopped shaking. At the blood on his own uniform that no longer seemed quite so important. Hog 3-7, you are cleared hot. There is no diplomacy in this valley today. Music to my ears, Reaper, 30 seconds. The second gun run was shorter, more targeted. Webb watched through the window as the A-10 came in from the west, nose dipping slightly, and unleashed another burst that kicked up geysers of dirt and bone, and the shattered remains of confidence from fighters who'd thought they were hunting wounded prey. The aircraft pulled up sharply, trailing more smoke, engine coughing audibly even from the ground. Webb could see damage now, panels missing from the left wing, hydraulic fluid streaming behind like tears, multiple impact holes punched through control surfaces that should have made controlled flight impossible. Yet it flew. More than flew, it hunted. Reaper, Hog 3-7. I'm Winchester on 30 Mike. Still have Mavericks, but nothing's moving out there anymore except body parts. Your extract package is 6 minutes out. I'll maintain position and make sure nobody gets ideas about round 2. Copy, Hog 3-7. We, thank you doesn't really cover it. The laugh that came back was dry, edged with pain. Thank me by staying alive, Marine. I didn't burn half my fuel and most of my hydraulics just to watch you bleed out before the cavalry arrives. Webb pressed his hand against his shoulder wound, applying pressure he'd been too busy to apply before. Understood. Hog 3-7, what's your status? You need to get that bird home. There was a pause, long enough that Webb wondered if they'd lost connection. When the voice came back, it carried something new, not fear, not quite, but acknowledgement of a reality that couldn't be argued with. Home is relative at this point, Reaper. I've got maybe 15 minutes of flight time before this engine quits entirely. My hydraulics are reading 0 across the board, which means I'm flying on emergency backup that wasn't designed for combat maneuvering. And I'm pretty sure I'm leaving a trail of parts across half of Kandahar province. But I've got altitude and I've got airspeed, and most importantly, I've got you still breathing. We'll call that a successful mission and figure out the landing part when it becomes immediately relevant. Jen spoke for the first time in what felt like hours. She's going to crash. Webb nodded slowly, probably. Because of us. Because she chose to. Davis had his eyes fixed on the sky, tracking the damaged A-10 as it circled overhead like a broken guardian angel. Who is she? What's her call sign mean? Hog 37. Webb didn't have answers. Didn't have much except gratitude and the slowly settling realization that they were going to survive. That someone had chosen their lives over her own safety, had flown a dying aircraft into combat because the alternative was unacceptable. The extract helicopters arrived exactly 6 minutes later, Black Hawks with door gunners scanning sectors that had gone silent. Webb and his team loaded quickly, efficiently, with the practiced speed of men who understood exactly how temporary security could be. As the helicopter lifted, Webb kept his eyes on the circling A-10, watching it struggle to maintain altitude, watching black smoke stream behind it like a funeral shroud. The pilot's voice came through one last time. Reaper 2-1, you are safely extracted. Hog 37 is RTB. Maybe, probably, we'll see. Godspeed, Hog, we owe you everything. You owe me nothing, Marine. This is what we do. This is what we've always done. You just don't usually get to see it from the ground. The radio clicked off. Webb watched the A-10 turn east, limping toward Kandahar airfield 30 kilometers away, trailing smoke and leaking fluids and defying every principle of aerodynamics through what could only be described as sheer bloody-minded determination. Davis nudged him. Think she'll make it? Webb didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the truth was complex and uncertain and wrapped up in variables he couldn't control. What he could control was memory. What he could do was remember the voice that had stayed calm while flying a broken aircraft into danger. The pilot who'd looked at impossible odds and chosen to fight anyway. The woman whose call sign he didn't even know but whose actions he'd carry for the rest of his life. The helicopter banked south, taking them towards safety and medical treatment and the thousand small indignities of survival. Behind them, the damaged A-10 grew smaller against the Afghan sky, a dark speck trailing darker smoke, refusing to fall. Webb closed his eyes and let exhaustion take him, trusting that somewhere behind his eyelids, angels came in gray-green paint with 30-millimeter cannons and voices that didn't shake even when everything else did. The debriefing came 3 days later, after the emergency surgeries and the initial medical stabilization. Webb sat in a temporary office at Kandahar Airfield, his shoulder properly bandaged now, his mind clearer than it had been since the valley. Across from him sat a full-bird colonel whose name tag read Matthews, and whose expression suggested he'd seen every variation of combat story the human experience could produce. Next to Matthews sat a major from the Air Force, younger, with the kind of intensity that came from caring too much about details others might overlook. Staff Sergeant Webb, Matthews began, his voice carrying the graveled texture of a career spent shouting over helicopters and mortar fire. You've submitted a formal commendation request for the pilot of Hog 37. I need to understand exactly what happened in that valley, step by step, because the flight data we've recovered is concerning. Webb straightened despite his shoulder's protest. Sir, I don't know what the data shows, but I know what I saw. That pilot saved my team from a tactical situation with 0 survival probability. She flew a damaged aircraft into heavy contact, executed multiple gun runs under conditions that should have been impossible, and maintained position until our extract was complete. Without her, we don't have this conversation because I'm dead in a compound in Helmand. The Air Force major leaned forward. The aircraft you're describing as damaged had sustained catastrophic battle damage, Sergeant. Hog 37 took multiple hits during an earlier close air support mission approximately 40 minutes before your contact. She was ordered to RTB immediately. Instead, she diverted to your position. She said she was 8 minutes out. She was, because she ignored direct orders to land and return to base. She flew a crippled aircraft at low altitude through contested airspace because she heard your call for support and decided regulations mattered less than your life. Matthews held up a hand. Major, let's focus on facts rather than editorial commentary. Staff Sergeant, did the pilot communicate her aircraft's status to you during the engagement? Webb thought back, replaying the radio traffic in his head. She acknowledged she was damaged, said she was running on one engine and trailing smoke, but her tone— he paused, searching for the right words. Sir, she sounded like someone reporting minor turbulence, not catastrophic system failure. She was calm, professional, gave us confidence when we had none. That would be consistent with her personality profile, the Major said quietly. Something in his voice made Webb look closer. The Major's jaw was tight, his hands pressed flat against the table like he was physically restraining something. Captain Reina Vasquez, call sign Hog 37, 8 years in service, 3 combat deployments, 247 combat missions. She's got a distinguished flying cross, 3 air medals with valor, and a reputation for being exactly where she's needed when everyone else is following procedure. The past tense in that sentence hit Webb like incoming fire. You said is. She made it back right. Matthews and the Major exchanged a look that contained entire conversations Webb wasn't privy to. Finally, Matthews spoke. Captain Vasquez attempted to land at Kandahar Airfield. She made it to within half a kilometer of the runway before complete engine failure, ejected at approximately 300 feet altitude, survived the ejection but sustained significant injuries. She's currently at Landstuhl Medical Center in Germany. Relief and guilt hit simultaneously, a 1-2 combination that left Webb momentarily speechless. She's alive. She's alive, the Major confirmed. Broken pelvis, compression fractures in her spine, severe burns on her left side from the fire that destroyed her engine compartment. The doctors say she'll recover, but her flying career is most likely over. The damage to her back makes ejection seats medically inadvisable going forward. The words hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Webb processed them slowly, each implication unpacking itself in real time. She ended her career for us. She ended her career doing her job, Matthews corrected, but there was no heat in it. The question before us is whether her actions merit commendation or court-martial. She directly disobeyed orders. She endangered an expensive aircraft. She took unnecessary risks with her own life. She saved 3 Marines who would otherwise be dead, Webb shot back, anger cutting through the careful deference he usually maintained with senior officers. Sir, with respect, if that doesn't merit commendation, then I don't understand what we're doing here. What's the point of having air support if pilots won't use it when we need it most? The Major smiled slightly. It wasn't a happy expression. You're not wrong, Sergeant, but you're also not seeing the bigger picture. Captain Vasquez has a pattern. This is the 4th time she's pushed damaged aircraft beyond recommended limits to provide close air support. The 2nd time she's been explicitly ordered to RTB and refused. Command has to balance her effectiveness against the precedent her actions set. If every pilot decides personal judgment supersedes orders, we have chaos instead of coordination. And if every pilot follows orders when Marines are dying, we have corpses instead of survivors. Matthews actually laughed at that. You'd have made a good lawyer, Webb. Unfortunately for your argument, military aviation doesn't run on moral clarity. It runs on regulations written in the blood of pilots who learned the hard way why rules exist. Captain Vasquez knew the risks. She chose to take them anyway. Now we have to decide whether to pin a medal on her or a letter of reprimand in her file. Webb met the colonel's eyes. Sir, I'm not a lawyer or a pilot or anyone whose opinion matters in this decision, but I am a Marine who was about to die, and Captain Vasquez decided that wasn't acceptable. She flew through hell to reach us, put rounds on target while her aircraft was burning, and stayed on station until we were safe. If that deserves punishment, then respectfully, the system is broken. The room went quiet. Outside, jets roared down runways, the constant background noise of an air base at war. Finally, Matthews nodded. Your statement will be part of the official record. We'll take it into consideration along with everything else. Dismissed, Sergeant. Webb stood, favoring his injured shoulder, and moved toward the door. He was halfway through when the major called out. Sergeant, for what it's worth, Captain Vasquez didn't file any reports about that mission. Didn't mention the disobeyed orders or the engine failure or the fact that she flew 18 additional minutes on backup systems that should have failed within 3. She wrote it up as a standard close air support mission that ended with successful extract and acceptable aircraft damage. If you hadn't filed for commendation, this would have disappeared into routine paperwork. Webb turned back. Why would she do that? Because she doesn't think she did anything special. In her mind, she just did her job. The fact that doing her job required ignoring regulations, defying physics, and nearly dying doesn't register as noteworthy. It's just Tuesday for Reina Vasquez. Back in the medical ward, Webb found Chen and Davis recovering in adjacent beds, both looking significantly better than they had 3 days ago. They'd heard about the debriefing, had gotten the same basic information about their guardian angel lying in a German hospital with a shattered pelvis and a career in ruins. None of them said much. There wasn't much to say. They were alive because someone else had decided their lives were worth more than her own safety. That kind of debt didn't have a payment plan. Davis finally broke the silence. You think they'll give her the medal? I don't know, Webb admitted, but I know she earned it, every piece of it. Chen stared at the ceiling, his voice distant. Hog 37, wonder what her actual name is, what she looks like, whether she knows what she did for us. Reina Vasquez, Webb said quietly. Captain Reina Vasquez, and yeah, she knows. She was conscious through the whole thing, made the choice with open eyes. 3 Marines lay in their beds and thought about a pilot they'd never met. A voice on a radio that had become the difference between life and death. A woman who'd taken a broken aircraft and turned it into salvation through nothing more than skill and stubborn refusal to let anyone die on her watch. Outside, the war continued. Inside, 3 men tried to figure out how to live with the weight of having been saved. 6 weeks later, Webb received orders stateside for medical evaluation and potential medical retirement. His shoulder had been damaged worse than initial assessments indicated, nerve damage that would require extensive physical therapy and might never fully heal. He was sitting in a coffee shop near Camp Pendleton, watching civilians go about their lives with the distant fascination of someone who'd forgotten what peace looked like, when his phone rang. Unknown number, German country code. Staff Sergeant Webb, the voice was familiar, strained with pain and medication but familiar. This is Captain Reina Vasquez. I heard you filed a commendation. Thought I should probably call and tell you that was unnecessary. Webb nearly dropped his phone. Captain, ma'am, how did you get my number? The Marine Corps takes operational security seriously right up until someone actually wants to find someone. Then everyone's suddenly helpful. How's the shoulder? Better than your pelvis, I'm guessing. A dry laugh, cut short by what sounded like significant pain. Fair point. Listen, I'm calling because I need you to understand something. What happened in that valley wasn't heroic. It was standard close air support executed under suboptimal conditions. You don't need to make it into something it wasn't. Webb felt anger kindle in his chest. Suboptimal conditions. That's what you call flying a burning aircraft on one engine while ignoring direct orders to land. I call it doing my job. You were in contact, you needed support, I was in position to provide it. The fact that my aircraft was damaged is irrelevant. The mission was clear. Your career is over because of us. Silence on the line, long enough that Webb wondered if they'd lost connection. When Vasquez spoke again, her voice was quieter. My career is over because I made choices. Good choices, I think, but mine nonetheless. You don't get to carry that guilt, Marine. I saw the tactical situation, ran the numbers, and decided 3 lives were worth 1 aircraft and whatever consequences came with it. I'd make the same call tomorrow. Even knowing how it ended. Especially knowing how it ended. Because you're alive, Chen's alive, Davis is alive, I'm alive and I'll walk again eventually. That's not tragedy, Sergeant, that's the best possible outcome. Webb rubbed his face, exhaustion settling over him like fog. They're debating whether to give you a medal or a court-martial. My commendation might make things harder for you. Let them debate. I've got bigger concerns like whether physical therapy actually works or if it's just organized torture with better PR. But Webb, thank you for caring enough to file the paperwork, for thinking what I did mattered. Most close air support missions, the guys on the ground never know our names. We're just voices on a radio. The fact that you took the time to make it official, that means something. You saved our lives. I did my job, there's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, you went above and beyond anything that could reasonably be called duty. You risked everything for 3 people you'd never met. Another pause. When Vasquez spoke again, her voice carried an edge of something Webb couldn't quite identify. Can I tell you something, Sergeant? Something I've never told anyone officially because it sounds insane when you say it out loud. Yes, ma'am. I didn't do it for strangers. I mean, I did, but that's not the whole truth. I did it because 8 years ago, when I was a second lieutenant on my first deployment, I was in a convoy that got hit by an IED. Rolled our vehicle, killed my driver, left me trapped in burning wreckage. I was about to die, Sergeant. Had accepted it, made peace with it, said my goodbyes in my head. And then a Marine Corps helicopter pilot named Captain Michael Reeves flew into heavy fire, landed 20 meters from our burning vehicle, and pulled me out. Took shrapnel in his leg doing it. Earned a Navy Cross for that rescue. Died 3 months later in a completely unrelated crash that had nothing to do with heroism and everything to do with mechanical failure. I made a promise to myself that day. If I ever had the chance to be what Captain Reeves was for me, I'd take it. No matter the cost. No hesitation. That valley wasn't about orders or regulations or career advancement. It was about a promise to a dead man who decided I was worth saving. Webb felt something shift in his chest, some piece of understanding clicking into place. So you pay it forward. Every single day, every mission, every time I strap into that cockpit, I'm carrying Captain Reeves with me, carrying the debt I can never repay except by being exactly who he was when it mattered most. You don't owe me gratitude, Sergeant. You owe Captain Reeves. And someday, when you're in position to save someone who needs it, you'll pay that debt forward too. The call ended shortly after. Webb sat in the coffee shop, his cooling coffee forgotten, and thought about chains of consequence stretching across years and deaths and the random chaos of combat. A helicopter pilot saves a lieutenant. The lieutenant becomes a captain. The captain saves 3 Marines. The Marines would go on to save others, or teach others, or simply live lives that mattered. Links in a chain that started with someone named Michael Reeves deciding that a burning lieutenant was worth flying into fire. He pulled out his laptop and started writing. Not a report, not a statement, a letter to Captain Reeves's family if he could find them. To tell them that their son's death had meaning beyond his final crash, that his legacy was flying on broken wings over an Afghan valley, refusing to let anyone die who could be saved. That courage multiplied across time and distance and became something larger than any single person could contain. The words came slowly at first, then faster, each sentence an attempt to capture something he barely understood himself. By the time he finished, the coffee shop was closing and the sun had set, and he'd written 4 pages that would never be enough but were all he had to offer. Back at Landstuhl Medical Center, Captain Reina Vasquez lay in her hospital bed and stared at the ceiling, counting the tiles because counting was better than thinking about the pain medication wearing off or the physical therapy appointment tomorrow that would involve attempts to make her broken pelvis support weight it wasn't ready to support. Her phone sat on the bedside table, screen dark, the conversation with Webb still echoing in her head. She'd lied to him. Not about Captain Reeves or the promise or the reasons she flew into danger. Those were true, but she'd lied about not being heroic, about it being routine, because the truth was more complicated and less comfortable. The truth was she'd been terrified. Flying that damaged aircraft had been the most frightening experience of her career, and her career included being shot at, catching fire mid-flight, and ejecting from aircraft on 2 separate occasions. The cockpit had been filling with smoke. The controls had been responding with increasing sluggishness, each input delayed by dying hydraulics and compromised control surfaces. The master caution panel had lit up like a Christmas tree, every system screaming for attention she couldn't give while focusing on keeping the aircraft in the sky. She'd known, with absolute certainty, that she was going to crash, that the engine would quit or the wing would separate or the fire would reach something critical, and the whole aircraft would come apart around her. The question wasn't whether she'd crash. It was whether she'd crash before or after getting Webb and his team to safety. She'd chosen after, had pushed the aircraft past every limitation, ignored every warning, flown through fear until fear became just another gauge reading she didn't have time to monitor. And when the engine had finally quit, when she'd felt the aircraft start to drop out of the sky, she'd aimed for open ground and pulled the ejection handle and prayed to a god she wasn't sure she believed in that the parachute would open before the ground arrived. It had. Barely. She'd hit hard, felt things break, experienced pain that rewrote her understanding of what pain could be. But she'd been alive. And more importantly, Webb had been alive. Chen had been alive. Davis had been alive. That was the other lie. She'd told Webb it was about paying forward Captain Reeves's sacrifice. That was true but incomplete. The fuller truth was that somewhere along the way, in 8 years and 3 deployments and 247 combat missions, she'd stopped being able to separate her identity from her purpose. She was a close air support pilot. That wasn't just what she did. It was who she was. The cockpit wasn't where she worked. It was where she existed most fully, most completely, most truly herself. Flying broken aircraft into impossible situations wasn't heroic. It was definitional. It was the core essence of what it meant to be her. And now that was gone. Ejection seats and broken pelvises were medically incompatible. The doctors had been clear. She could fly again theoretically. Cargo planes, transport aircraft, anything that didn't require the ability to safely eject in an emergency. But A-10s, close air support, the mission that had defined her adult life, that door was closed, locked, welded shut by physics and medical necessity, and the simple fact that her spine couldn't handle another high-G ejection without permanent paralysis. She should have been devastated, should have been drowning in grief for a lost identity. Instead, she felt peaceful, like she'd completed something important, like the last 8 years had been building toward that moment in the valley, toward the choice between regulations and lives, toward the demonstration that some things mattered more than careers or aircraft or personal safety. She'd been a close air support pilot. Had been one so completely, so thoroughly, that she'd literally flown herself out of the ability to continue. There was poetry in that, symmetry, an ending that made sense of everything that had come before. A nurse entered to check vitals, asked the standard questions, made notes on a chart. Vasquez answered automatically, her mind elsewhere, thinking about Webb, about Chen and Davis, about Captain Reeves 8 years dead but still flying, somehow in the choices she made. Thinking about the chain of salvation stretching backward and forward through time, each link forged by someone deciding that strangers were worth dying for. She'd added her link. had welded it into place with burning fuel and failing engines, and a refusal to let mathematics determine outcomes when will could intervene. The medal came through 3 months later, Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor, presented in a ceremony at Ramstein Air Base while Vasquez stood with a cane, her pelvis healed enough to walk but still protesting every step. The citation read like fiction: willful disregard for personal safety, extraordinary heroism in combat, actions above and beyond the call of duty. It didn't mention the disobeyed orders. Didn't mention the court-martial that had been quietly shelved after enough senior officers reviewed the tactical situation and concluded that sometimes regulations needed to be broken by the right people for the right reasons. It just mentioned saving 3 lives in a valley in Helmand while flying a crippled aircraft through conditions that should have been impossible. Webb was there. He'd flown commercial from California, used his own leave, showed up in his dress blues looking uncomfortable and proud and carrying guilt he'd probably carry forever. They'd never met in person before, had only talked on the phone and through email, comparing memories, building a friendship forged in smoke and violence, and the shared understanding of people who'd seen death up close and chosen to keep living anyway. He stood at attention during the ceremony, his injured shoulder held carefully, his eyes never leaving Vasquez's face. When she received the medal, when the general pinned it to her uniform and shook her hand with the careful firmness of someone who knew exactly what it had cost, Webb saluted. Sharp, crisp, holding it longer than regulation required. Chen and Davis were there too, flanking Webb like honor guards, their own injuries healed or healing, their presence a testimony more powerful than any citation could capture. After the ceremony, in the reception area where officers mingled and made small talk over drinks, neither inspirational nor particularly alcoholic, Webb approached Vasquez. Up close, he was younger than she'd imagined. Maybe 26, with eyes that had seen too much too quickly and a bearing that spoke of competence earned through fire. They shook hands awkwardly, both aware that handshakes couldn't possibly contain what needed to be communicated.